Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. I am your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I'm a priest of the Legionaries of Christ, and I'm a theology professor. And this is a podcast on the Star Cruise Production Network on sqpn.com. Today, we are covering a little more of the history, Vatican I and Vatican II, again with Dr. Robert Fastigi from Sacred Heart in Detroit. If you want to follow along, or we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican. So welcome back, Dr. Fastigi. I hope all is going well for you.
Yes, everything is fine. We're in the Advent season now, so it's a wonderful.
Yes. Even though these are playing the first week of January, we did record them in November and December, so it is just in case you're wondering there.
Maybe I should not have.
Don't worry, that's fine. Anyway, so Dr. Fastigi, again, he's the chair of dogmatic theology of Christology at Sacred Heart Major Seminary. He was teaching me back when I was studying there a few years ago, almost close to a decade ago, I think, 8 years ago. He has his PhD from Fordham in 1987. He's the editor of the New Catholic Encyclopedia and the English editor of Denzinger at various times. And so that's where we were. Last episode, we finished with Trent, and we have a big gap after Trent where there's like several hundred years we don't have a council. And in that time, we have a lot of things happen. You know, the Trent was really the Renaissance at the end of just after the Renaissance, but you have afterwards, you still have, you know, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the kind of modern nation state forming and things like that. And the church needs to respond to these kind of developments. And that's really what we get in Vatican I and Vatican II, is responding to a new world that we're in, that most of us would think of as the norm, but was not the norm for most of the history of the church for us, how modern nations work and things like that. So today, we're going to cover briefly Vatican I, a little bit of the time between the two councils, and then Vatican II as well. And this is just more of the history aspect. We're going to cover each document individually after this, but I thought just kind of this as a background is a good place to start. So, Vatican I happened in the 1800s. There were two big decrees in Vatican I that came out. Could you tell us about those decrees, Dr. Fastigi?
Yes. Well, there was the decree, the Constitution on the Catholic faith, Dei Filius, and that deals with faith and reason. And what was important is to understand that this was one of the motivating factors in Blessed Pius IX's decision to call the council. And the 19th century, for those of us who studied a little bit of intellectual history, you know that there was skepticism, pantheism, materialism, German idealism. All of this was going on. And in 1864, Pius IX had issued an encyclical, and attached to that was the 1864 Syllabus of Errors. And so in that Syllabus of Errors, you could see that there were concerns about the denial of miracles, rationalism, indifferentism, which means it doesn't matter what religion you belong to. You know, all are equally salvific. So these were some of the concerns. And then in December of 1864, he decided to announce an ecumenical council, which was 301 years after the closing of the Council of Trent. But new challenges had emerged, and so there was a preparatory commission, and then it began in 1869, and then there were these two, as you mentioned, wonderful decrees, or we could call them constitutions, really. The dogmatic constitution on the Catholic faith, which is known by its beginning of Dei Filius, the Son of God. And you see, this was dealing with the question of God and his manifestation to human beings, but primarily concerned with faith and reason, because some were becoming rationalists, that we only understand that which can be proven by reason. And others were responding to the other extreme, fideis, that we just have to go by faith. There's no support in reason at all. So Dei Filius is a magnificent synthesis of faith and reason. It's very Thomistic in that sense, very scholastic. And in terms of the drafting of it, the original draft was by the Jesuit theologian Franzlin, and it had 18 chapters, but that was thought to be too long. And so a German bishop was asked to oversee a shortening of it. And he enlisted the aid of another Jesuit named Kreutgen, and it was reduced to four chapters. And it was so well done that the final vote on it was 667 to 0, a unanimous affirmation by the bishops who voted on it. So this is marvelous. But what I like about it is, it affirms the reality of miracles, but it also affirms that faith and reason never contradict each other. And also, God can be known with certitude through the things that he has made. This is what is sometimes called natural theology, but that the one true God can be known with certitude through the things that he has made. And in terms of what is it that we must believe, by faith. And it says clearly, all those things are to be believed with divine and Catholic faith that are contained in the Word of God, written or handed down, and which by the Church, either by solemn judgment or through her ordinary and universal teaching office or magisterium, are proposed for belief as having been divinely revealed. So this is I think it's one of the most magnificent documents of an ecumenical council, Dei Filius, the harmony of faith and reason. Now, the other document did not have quite such a unanimous assent. It was a little bit controversial. And the original plan was to have a whole constitution on the church as a whole. But the political situation was a little bit difficult during that time. And there was what is known as the Italian unification movement, the Risorgimento. So the people states, and bit by bit, they were being taken away. And so they realized, some of the bishops knew that there was the desire to not only teach papal primacy, but also papal infallibility. And so that was put then, let us say, at the forefront. And then there was a preliminary vote. It was agreed that 2/3 majority would pass. So there was a preliminary vote, July 13th, 1870, and 451 out of 601 bishops voting said yes. So if you have 600, it means you just needed a little over 400. Then,
you got about 3/4 there.
Right there. And 2 said what is called in Latin, placet juxta modum. We agree, but we would like to see modifications, or it's a kind of conditional approval, or approval but with reservations. And then 88 non placet, it doesn't please. No. Well, the final vote was 535 to 2. And what happened? Why did it reduce? Then you have, so you only have 537 voting. What happened to the 601? Well, when some of the bishops who were opposed to the dogma of papal infallibility, they saw that they lost about a little over 60 just left Rome. A few didn't quite leave, but they just didn't cast their vote at the end. So it was 535 to 2. And the two who voted against it in the final vote, one was a bishop from southern Italy, and the other was the bishop of all places, Little Rock, Arkansas. And
I didn't even know the Diocese of Little Rock was that old.
Well, that's Little Rock, Arkansas, and then but both of those bishops went to Pius IX after the vote, and they said, "Your Holiness, we voted against it, but now we accept it." So yes. the joke was the Little Rock, was deferential to the Big Rock, So
exactly. And those are the main two documents of Vatican I. And Vatican I kind of ended a little abruptly. You were mentioning Italian reunification. One of the things that those who aren't familiar with the history of Italy is that until this time period, Italy was broken up into 10 different states. And one of the ones in the center was the Papal States, which was, a decent size, not the biggest, most powerful, but it was a decent size in the middle of Italy, whereas now it was reduced to just the Vatican today. So what kind of attitudes did the bishops have when the council was kind of shut down by this kind of movement to reunite Italy and such? What kind of attitude do the bishops have towards the end of towards the council at that point when they kind of ended abruptly?
Well, actually, it was suspended, and then it was thought maybe it will be resumed, and so on, and so. But what happened then? It was a turbulent time for the Papal States, and some actually thought, well, there's no need for another ecumenical council because the Pope can teach infallibly. He could resolve disputes on his own. But Pius XI thought about reconvening the council, and so did Pius XII. They decided against it, and then
yes,
and don't forget what was happening in the interim. There were these two major world wars, and then as far as the papacy was concerned, there was what is called the Roman question. So between 1870 and 1929, when there was the Lateran Pact, formulated with, of all people, Benito Mussolini. But it was then finally it was decided, well, no, the church would have her own state, Vatican City State, which is about 106 acres with some territories outside of that. But the Italian unification movement was generally thought to be under the leadership of Freemasons, and Garibaldi, when he took over Rome, he tried to give assurance to Pius IX. Don't worry, we've always respected the church. And we don't have this in a tape recording, because they didn't have tape recordings then, but according to some historians, what Pius IX said, he looked at him and he said, "Belle parole, ma brutti fatti."
Beautiful words, but difficult facts or ugly facts.
Yeah. So that it was resolved, but it was a difficult time for the church. Let's put it that way. And that really gives us the political situation between the two councils. What about the theological situation? Generally, when I hear about it, I hear about like manualism and ressourcement, or the liturgical renewal with ressourcement. It's kind of like two kind of schools or modes of doing theology in that, in those 90-ish years between the two councils. Could you explain those two schools and a little bit of like the theological history between the two councils briefly? Yes. Well, don't forget, in between Vatican I and Vatican II, we have some outstanding popes. Leo XIII, and then Pius X, who had to combat modernism, and there's higher biblical criticism forming. But then there was the beginning of the movement, two very important movements, which I think influenced the calling of Vatican II. One was the liturgical movement, that there was a thought, now we want to look at the liturgy and see in what ways can it be enriched, because there was patristic studies and so on, and there was a thought we want to also have the congregation be more attentive. That people would use the expression, I'm going to hear Mass. It was something the priest did, and the people were there, just part of this, in attendance, but they wanted active and conscious participation. And Pius XII had spoken about this too in Mediator Dei, his encyclical of 1947. So there was the liturgical movement, and then there was also the ecumenical movement. Now, what had happened is this: there were these Protestant-inspired ecumenical meetings, faith and order and so on. And then there was the formation of a World Council of Churches, and these were operating under a Protestant ecclesiology, or a Protestant idea of the churches. And so the Catholic Church, the Pope said, we pray for Christian unity, but we do not participate in these. So then there was the desire to develop a Catholic theology of ecumenism. And that's what happened at Vatican II. But in terms of the intellectual movements, like as you mentioned, there was neo-scholasticism. And scholasticism really is continuous from the Middle Ages, and then it continues, and then there's the second Baroque scholasticism after Trent. And then there was neo-scholasticism in the 19th century in the revival of Thomism under Leo XIII with Aeterni Patris, 1879. But then there was another school forming, especially in France and Germany, and it was called Ressourcement. And they said scholasticism has become kind of manualistic. That in seminaries and elsewhere, they weren't studying Thomas Aquinas or Bonaventure or Scotus. They were reading manuals. Now, I'm not opposed to these manuals, and they served a purpose, but they were not getting the seminarians in touch with the sources, but someone else, like the Spanish Jesuits in the early 50s, they have this, Summa Sacrae Theologiae, and then you have Ludwig Ott, this German seminary professor, coming out with the fundamentals of Catholic dogma in the early 50s. So this was sometimes called manual Thomism, but the others like Henri de Lubac, Jean Danielou, Yves Congar, and others, they were saying, no, we want to have a theology enriched by Scripture and also the Church Fathers.
No, definitely. And you probably, and some of our listeners may have heard of some of those people before. We're not going to go in depth in any of those specific theologians Dr. Vestigi mentioned, but that kind of gives us the background of the theology coming up to Vatican II. John the 23rd, when he was elected, he was kind of an older man. A lot of times he was expected just to be, he'll be Pope for a few years until it becomes clear we can find somebody else to be the Pope. But he ends up calling a council. Could you give us a little bit of background of like when and why he called the council?
Yes. Well, he announces the Ecumenical Council January 25th, 1959 to a number of cardinals there in Rome. And it came as something of a surprise. Now, there's two theories as to why he called the council. One is that when he became Pope, he started receiving so many suggestions, and he said, I can't do this. We have to call a council. The other is something mentioned by St. John Paul II, that it was an inspiration of the Holy Spirit and that he felt called to do this. And what we could say in terms of his biography, Angelo Roncalli, later Cardinal Roncalli of Venice, he had worked as a diplomat, and he had been in Turkey, and he had been in Bulgaria, and he had a lot of contact with Eastern Orthodox. And so he had that was one great desire for reunion with the Orthodox churches, the separated brethren. And then you also have the ecumenical movement, which in Western Europe was concerned mostly with Anglicans and Protestants. And so that was one concern. Also, there was the liturgical movement. And also, he just thought there was a need for a more missionary church. And so he called the council, and there were preparatory commissions and so on. But there were a lot of, then bishops were allowed to submit their proposals. And I've read in the acta of the council, the preliminary proposals, and Cardinal Ottaviani was receiving these in the Holy Office, and you read them, and they wanted, communism condemned, materialism condemned. They wanted a reaffirmation of all these condemnations. There were proposals for new dogmas because they're to define Mary as mediatrix of all graces, and others to say, define her also as the co-redemptrix of the human race. That title had been approved by Leo XIII and then used by Pius XI. But John the 23rd then said, no, this is a council which is going to be primarily pastoral in orientation. So we do not want any new dogmas. And so that was, for those who wanted new dogmas and so on, they had to understand that. So, but he said, what is the purpose of the council? It is to make the sacred deposit, to have the sacred deposit of faith, presented with greater vitality, to make it more efficacious. Then there was the buzzword of aggiornamento, updating. But that's not just updating doctrines. It means getting ourselves updated, a renewal, an interior renewal of the faithful. And there was also, so there was the concern of ecumenism, liturgy, but also I should mention this. Vatican I defined the infallibility of the Pope, but what about the relationship of the Pope to the bishops? And so Vatican II then picked up with what Vatican I did not treat, though there were plans of treating the entire church. And so then we have the magnificent document Lumen Gentium, which tries to explain how the Pope operates, the Roman Pontiff operates as the head of the College of Bishops, and that the bishops also teach infallibly, especially at an ecumenical council, but always in communion with the Pope. But then also even when scattered throughout the world, they, in communion with the Pope, they come to one teaching or decision, one sententia in Latin, one thesis, one opinion, that is definitively to be held. So that's what's called the ordinary universal magisterium. But I'm talking too much, Father. Maybe you have some.
No, I get that. And I think the idea of, the situation of the world changes, so you need an updated pastoral thing is also important, like we were noting. I know for myself, when I looked at models for priesthood, and not just but for actual ministry, one of the things I thought about was priests after the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution changed society so much and how society is structured, that how we do ministry as priests, not like we still celebrate mass or confessions, but beyond that in the ministry, it changed so much. I picked people like St. John Bosco, Venerable Fulton Sheen as kind of models of priesthood for myself, but I think most of our audience would know who they are. And so we were talking about the preparatory documents for Vatican II, because there was, it started, he announced it January 1959. It was November 1962. So almost 4 years until it started. What kind of preparatory documents were prepared in that time? Because there definitely were some preparatory documents prepared, And I think that's important for the history of Vatican II to talk about the preparatory documents compared to the final documents.
It's a very good question, Father. Well, a total of 75 drafts were introduced in that preparatory period. Then that was reduced to 22 and then further reduced to 8. But in the final analysis, some of them were broken up, and we have a total of 16 documents at Vatican II. The 4 constitutions and then 3 declarations, right? And then 9 decrees. And so this is just the way it developed. And we also have to remember that John the 23rd convoked the council. It was beginning, but he died in 1963. And in the first session, no documents were approved. So his successor then, Paul VI, after being elected Pope, said the council will continue. And so that was when the work was done. And there were some different points of view at the council. I know I teach Mariology, so I could say that, well, originally there was the thought that Mariology would be treated in the Constitution of the Church. Then it was decided very early on in 62, no, because there were so many petitions to talk about Marian mediation and her union with Christ in redemption, that it needs a separate document. Well, then in October of 1963, these two sides, whether to include it in what came to be Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution of the church, or have a separate document, they were divided. So they had one cardinal argue for a separate document, Cardinal Santos of Manila in the Philippines, and then Cardinal Koenig of Vienna in Austria said to be included. So it was a very narrow vote. Originally all decisions had to be decided by 2/3 majority, but Paul VI wanted to keep things moving, so he changed it to just a simple majority. So it was decided by a simple majority of a difference of 40 votes to include it as which came to be Chapter 8 in Lumen Gentium. Yeah,
and it is still so different. Like in this podcast, when I made it for the year, I generally have one person for each document as an interview. But then I picked in Lumen Gentium, we're going to have a separate person for Chapter 8 and do a separate interview because it is almost like a separate document, even though it is part of Lumen Gentium. So now we're getting into like kind of the history. The Vatican II lasts from 1962 to 1965. And we just want to do an overview of the history. We're going to go into each of the documents and we'll talk a little bit about their individual development when I talk with the people who are more expert in each of those documents. I think it's important just to talk about some general things, like the size of the council and how the process by which these documents in general, with committees and things like that. But so it's called the Second Vatican Council. It's the second one that took place in the Vatican in St. Peter's. And so, how are these meetings run? How many bishops were there? Things like that. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, exactly. Well, there were more bishops at the Second Vatican Council than at any other council. So that much is clear. That you had like we went over the votes of these other councils, and so you have 535 to 2 at the end of Vatican I for the Pastor Aeternus, defining papal infallibility. But here you have, it was, in terms of the numbers, I think you look at the final votes and you get an idea of how many were voting. So, for example, because some were behind the Iron Curtain, they couldn't make it in time. But you see, in terms of a lot of the votes, it's usually roughly around 2,400. There's 2,400. So, for example, like the decree on social communications of the media. So the vote in 1963, 1,960 in favor and 164 opposed. But then you get to the dogmatic constitution on the church, and the final vote is 2,151 for and 5 against. So roughly, usually just around 2,200, 2,300 in the final voting. But I think some estimate there were about 2,800 who were eligible to come, and some weren't able to come for various reasons.
Yeah. Well, the Iron Curtain, and also health reasons. As we're recording this yesterday, the ex-bishop of my home diocese passed away at 81, and he had retired early in his early 70s for health reasons. 7 years ago or so, 8 years ago. And so, if the Ecumenical Council was called, 3 years ago, he probably couldn't have come because he struggled so much with his health. To fly from Canada to Rome would have been too much for him at that point in his life. And it's really interesting when you see the pictures in St. Peter's. It's very nice of the whole council there with that. So you mentioned it was very pastoral as well. Now, getting to the process. So the documents, you talk about how they were presented, and then most of the documents were kind of sent to some kind of subcommittee and brought back at a later version, things like that. Can you explain that process a little bit, and how the council arranged for that? So they would have the documents, at the main council, then at a committee, then at the main council, and things like that?
Yes. Well, at first there was the establishment of an anti-preparatory commission under Cardinal Tardini and Monsignor Pericole Felici. And they were collecting all of these suggestions. And then in 1960, John the 23rd announces that there would be a pre-preparatory phase, that the pre-preparatory phase had ended. And then he instituted the bodies responsible for drawing up the texts. So he established, in the interim, had established the Secretariat for Promoting the Unity of Christians under Cardinal Bea. But then there was established the Preparatory Theological Commission, which was very, very important, and in the preparation of the draft documents. And this was Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani presided over this theological commission with Archbishop Pietro Parente and Father Sebastian Tromp, S.J., as close collaborators. And so these were the draft documents were being drawn up. Some of the ressourcement school, like Yves Congar, a Dominican, were very critical of these draft documents. They said they read like theological manuals, So then there was finally this Central Theological Commission was also formed, and a Central Preparatory Commission composed of cardinals and archbishops from around the world. So now you have these different commissions so that a smaller group, and then sub-commissions were formed to review the criticisms, suggestions regarding the draft documents. So you then have the Central Theological Commission, right? And then these sub-commissions formed. So this was what was going on in all these commissions. So that was all formed to help the council move along more smoothly.
Oh, definitely. And that's how each of the documents also had their own commissions when they were writing it, between kind of when they first were presented, and then, they discuss in the main council, and then the committee would then be responsible for editing in accord with what the consensus was in the main discussion, things like that. And then they were all voted on by all the bishops at the end. As you noted, usually it's about 2,200-ish bishops or so. It's really interesting that they required 2/3, but all of them got over 90%, and most of them over 99%. The only one that the one you mentioned, Interim on social communications, got, it was 1,950 to 150, and that was the most opposition. All the other ones got over 2,000 votes in favor, and oftentimes 5-10 votes against kind of range. So you're very clearly showing the unity of the whole church in this council, not just, this faction or that faction of bishops, pushed their will on this other large faction. No, we're talking 99 point something % of the vote most of the time.
Exactly. I have the statistics I could briefly mention here.
Okay,
that, all were approved with at least 90%, 15 out of the 16 with at least 95%, and 10 of the 16 with 99% approval.
Yeah, so it's very, very clear, like overwhelming, and I also wonder if Interim Mirifica, which is the only one under 95, if it was necessarily a disagreement on the document itself, or I think some bishops might have questioned, why does the church need to make this decree? Because when I'm going to interview the person for that, that's like the first question I'm going to ask them. Why does the church talk about this? Because I do think that some people think that's not really something the church would make a decree on in an ecumenical council. Now, just before we go, this is kind of the last part. After Vatican II, we had a lot of what people would call the spirit of Vatican II. And I think a lot of times when people hear like Vatican II says this, and somebody else says Vatican II says the exact opposite of this, one of those often has to do with the spirit of Vatican II. Can you explain what is meant by the spirit of Vatican II, what it was meant back in like the 60s and 70s when it was a bigger kind of thing, even into the 80s, I guess, and how that would affect us now?
Yes, a very, 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 very good question. Well, Cardinal Ratzinger, and he became Pope Benedict XVI, commented on this because he was there as a young theologian, 35 years old. So he was a peritus, an expert there. And he said there were two councils. There was the real council, and then there was the council of the media. And so what would happen is journalists would take certain things out, and then they would introduce their own expectations and put their own spin on it. So most of the faithful would hear, this is what the council's deciding. And then the implementation of it was sometimes hijacked. That was the word that people used, by some who had their own agenda. And so actually it affected the priesthood. That celibacy was reaffirmed, though, for a priestly celibacy at the council, though it made accommodations for the Eastern Catholic rites that had a tradition of ordaining married men to the priesthood. But they had to be married first. Then there was this expectation, well, now, soon the Pope is going to allow priests to marry. So a lot of priests abandoned their call. And this really caused grave distress to St. Paul VI. And so there were people taking little things out of the council, like one saying, and then spinning it their own way. And then, of course, there was all the controversy over Humanae Vitae, and the great encyclical, I believe, of Paul VI, reaffirming the Church's teaching against contraception. And that was actually, there had been a commission formed just before Vatican II was going on, and Paul VI said, no, I don't want the council to decide this matter, I will. And then there were all these expectations, so that it was a revolutionary period of time. And I remember people saying, well, the church is a monarchy, it's got to become a democracy. I remember this in high school, when I was there in high school in the late 1960s. I'm older than you, Father, as you quite well know. So I remember these times and people talking about this. It was a turbulent time socially, with all the social protest movements, the war in Vietnam, and then the student protests in Europe in 1968. And so this is where really people were spinning Vatican II the wrong way. And Paul VI gave a remarkable homily, June 29th, 1972. And a lot of people remember the one line, the smoke of Satan has entered into the temple of God. But there's another line in there where he says, we believe that something preternatural has entered into the world specifically to suffocate the fruits of the ecumenical council. This was the Pope who approved all 16 documents, but he said, to disturb, to suffocate the fruits of the ecumenical council. So he was aware in 1972 that there was this false spirit of Vatican II.
Oh, definitely. That is a big issue. I've been reading a book recently put together by the Daughters of St. Paul, I think in 1970 or about there, on Vatican II and religious life. And you see a lot of what the Vatican actually said and what popes actually said and what great spiritual authors, they have Fulton Sheen in there. They have Alberione, Father James Alberione, their founder, in there because he passed away about 1970. I forget the exact day, the exact year, and things like that. And I think that's important to distinguish the spirit and what the council actually had, because I think for Catholics today, it's important this is the actual council. This is not the council of the media, as Benedict XVI called it. And I think this concludes our interview. I want to thank Dr. Fasigi immensely. He is the person I would think who knows the most, who has the most encyclopedic knowledge of theology and papal decrees and things like that. I'm really good, but I pale in comparison to him. And so, Dr. Fasigi, is there anything you want to share with the audience as far as a course you've done or something else or your social media or anything like that, where people might want to follow you or do a mini course or watch a presentation you've done or anything like that?
Well, I'm involved with Dr. Mark Miravalle he teaches at Franciscan University and also Ave Maria University. And we're doing this masterclass in Mariology. And so we just, usually once a week we meet and we talk about different things. And we also discussed Mariology at Vatican II. So, what happened there would clearly the, Christotypical Mariology, where you see Mary's relationship to Christ, and then ecclesiotypical Mariology, Mary's relationship to the church. So there were tensions, but there's what came out in chapter 8 is quite beautiful. But there were some who were opposed to what they called Marian maximalism. So there were tensions after that. So that's what I'm doing now with Dr. Miravalle.
Excellent. And should people just search you and Dr. Miravalle for that, or is there a specific website address for that?
I think if they did a Google search on a masterclass in Mariology and use our names, it would probably come up. I think it's sponsored by Vox Populi, group. And so we try to do our best. I mean, he's been working, since the early 90s for a deeper appreciation of what was called the Marian movement, which really began after the definition of the Immaculate Conception and continued so deeply up through the 1950s. But then there were some who, for ecumenism and for other reasons, wanted to slow it down. But there were petitions for the definition of Mary as mediatrix of all graces. And Pius XI formed 3 commissions to study the definability of this. A lot of people are not aware of this. And the first draft, which came to be chapter 8 in Lumen Gentium, spoke of Mary as mediatrix of all graces. And co-redemptrix was put in 2 footnotes. But those are gone by 1964. But these all came back under St. John Paul II. So what I would just say, Father, is people want to really understand Vatican II, read John Paul II and Paul VI, and also Pope Francis understands what was, how to properly understand Vatican II.
Excellent, Dr. Fasigi. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast. You could donate to help StarQuest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one time, monthly, or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow, we are going to start on Sacrosanctum Concilium with Father Land of the London Oratory. He's going to do a little interview for that. And this week might be a little longer because there are several interview episodes, which tend to be the longer episodes. So if you fall a little bit behind, don't worry. You can catch up in the following weeks. Please join us then tomorrow to learn more about Vatican II, which should provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information like individual reading lists or subscriptions to different podcasting platforms, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X, aka Twitter. And I will see you tomorrow.